Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 of the Ultimate Superman review. In this 3-part series, I'm going to cover the entire history of Superman on the big screen, from Christopher Reeve to Brandon Routh, from Henry Cavill to David Corenswet, from live action to animated, all in anticipation of James Gunn's upcoming film, Superman. In part 1, I talked about the classic era of Superman in film with the Kirk Alyn, George Reeves, and Christopher Reeve Superman films, but after the critical and financial failure of Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, Superman stayed out of the cultural zeitgeist until Superman the Animated Series made its debut in 1996, bringing us to the era of the DC animated universe. So in this video, I'll be covering all of the animated Superman films, not including any of the animated TV shows, but including all of the movies. If his name is in the title, it will be in this video. And through watching all of these films and seeing the many different animated continuities and standalone stories, it became very clear that the strengths of these animated stories also eventually became their biggest detractors for me. Alright, so I have a lot more projects to get into when it comes to the animated era of Superman in film than I did in the last video, so let's just start off with Superman Brainiac Attacks. When I began to watch all of the animated Superman films, I also decided to simultaneously watch Superman the Animated Series. I only got through about the first season because I did not have time to get into all of these shows, which is why they're not included in this video, but I ended up really enjoying what I had seen up until this point. If anything, watching the first season of that show really got me invested in the voices of Tim Daly as Clark Kent and Superman, along with the great Clancy Brown as Lex Luthor. A side effect of watching that season, however, was how much it affected my enjoyment of this movie in particular. This movie seems to be tangentially connected to the animated series. The character designs and the world look very similar. Tim Daly, Dana Delaney, and David Kaufman return as the voices of Superman, Lois, and Jimmy Olsen, and the overall tone is similar. However, Clancy Brown is replaced by Powers Booth, who just isn't the same, and the animation, for some reason, is really, really bad. I really like Brainiac in the first season of the animated series. He has a great setup, and as someone who's only ever explored Superman in live action, this is a character that I really knew nothing about. But this movie quickly contrasts the setup for that character in the series, firmly setting this as some standalone story, which immediately made me disconnect from this story. In this film, Brainiac crash lands on Earth and begins to steal a bunch of data from LexCorp before being destroyed by Superman, but in reality, Brainiac just downloads himself to Lex's servers to keep setting up his plan in the background. Lex discovers this, and he does what he always does, thinks he is in control of an all-powerful being, and falls right into Brainiac's trap. This leads to a story about Lex teaming up with Brainiac to destroy Superman, with him thinking that he'll be able to rule the Earth while Brainiac is free to take over any other world. But of course, Brainiac eventually turns on Lex. There's a huge battle with Superman against his Lex-created robotic form, which I liked so much less than his design at the beginning of the film and his design from the animated series. And then Superman saves the day. And honestly, the frustrating thing about this movie's story for me is Lex Luthor. For one, I'm much less engaged or threatened by Powers Booth's performance as compared to Clancy Brown. Nothing against Powers Booth. He is a great actor and a solid choice here, but the writing just does not help his case. He comes across as very dumb here, and it's supposed to be a story about the smartest Superman villain being taken advantage of by an even smarter Superman villain.
I am so happy. No, wait. I'm sad.
And for a Brainiac story to really be good, he has to be extremely clever, but the script here just isn't. There's also a couple of subplots in this that struck a nerve with me as well. Jimmy Olsen is on some mission to expose Lex's involvement in the Brainiac attacks, but his camera gets destroyed, so he accomplishes absolutely nothing here. And I've mentioned it many times in part 1, but my biggest pet peeve in any Superman story is how these older movies treat Lois Lane. She's once again clueless about Clark and Superman's identity, which is fine, I guess, but they play with my emotions here by giving Clark an arc to eventually tell her the truth about him being Superman, but apparently it's just a vision that the Phantom Zone gives him to try to stop him. And of course, the lesson Clark learns from this is to push those closest away from him to keep them safe, so he quits the Daily Planet to never see Lois again. I just hate it. And rather than rating all these Superman films in the same categories as I did with part 1, I'm just going to be giving these films an overall score, as these films don't all have a Daily Planet story or a Lois and Clark dynamic, and unfortunately, I somehow found myself enjoying this movie even less than Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, mainly because of the lack of Christopher Reeve. Unfortunately, I have to give this movie a sad 2 out of 5. Not a great start to the animated era. But things quickly turned around with Superman Doomsday, which is the first death of Superman story that I'll be talking about in this series so far, with many more to come. This movie pretty much begins right away with Superman's death, and the rest of the film follows the aftermath of the world, and specifically Lois mourning his loss. The film establishes right from the get-go that Superman and Lois Lane are in a relationship, although Superman doesn't reveal to Lois that he is Clark Kent, which, if you ask me, is pretty shady of him, as he essentially gets to spy on her at work without her ever knowing. Bad Superman. But what you also get is some real emotion to the film once Superman is actually killed. You get an epic fight with Doomsday with a massive improvement in animation from the Brainiac attacks film. The punches hit hard, the destruction levels are similar to that of Man of Steel, and you get the iconic imagery and lines from the comic.
We're safe. All of us.
Good. That's all that matters.
What follows is everyone's reaction to the death of Superman. And after watching this story be adapted in several different, versions, some succeeding and some failing, the one aspect that I feel is necessary for a death of Superman story to succeed is that of Lois Lane. She really does need to be the main character in any film or series that covers this type of story. I mean, for one, our lead character in Clark/Superman is dead, so you need to follow someone during this time, and no one is closer to that character or will have as much of an emotional connection to this death than Lois. My favorite scene in this entire movie is when Lois goes to visit Martha Kent in Smallville and reveals that she always knew the truth about Clark, but was kind of waiting for him to be comfortable enough to fully let her into his world.
No one else on this whole stupid planet can know what it felt like to really love him, to be loved by him.
So when it comes to the emotion of this movie revolving around Lois and the death of Superman, I think this movie succeeds greatly. Outside of this, the film also follows an evil scheme from Lex Luthor, of course. He is the one to discover Doomsday in a crashed ship and decides to let it run rampant to see what happens. Once it eventually does kill Superman, he releases his clone in an attempt to create a new hero that he can control. The clone storyline was fun. I was disappointed at first because I thought he just magically came back to life, but it was much more complicated than him simply just being resurrected. There's also an actual reason for the black suit Superman wears at the end, as he is weakened and needs a suit that can absorb sunlight to power him up, and once the clone is defeated, Lois and Superman wonder if the world will trust him the same after the clone attacked Metropolis, which they sadly don't get much into, but the question is presented to the audience, which I found to be nice. In terms of nitpicks, there's a weird subplot with a Jimmy Olsen bad boy arc and Perry White becoming a drunk. The lack of Clancy Brown, of course, as Lex Luthor was once again a big bummer to me. He honestly set the bar a little bit too high in terms of any Lex Luthor voices going forward. And during the Superman Doomsday fight, Superman throws him through a building presumably filled with people in order to save Lois and Jimmy in a helicopter, which definitely killed a ton of people. But overall, I did enjoy this film quite a bit, and the movie ending with Lois and Clark being together with no secrets between them was just perfect. 3.5 out of 5.
But I was the spelling bee champ of Smallville Elementary.
Clark.
Next up, we have our first Batman and Superman crossover, but not only do we have a crossover, we also get a ton of DC Rogues characters and other random heroes that I've never seen before. Lex Luthor is President of the United States who wants to prove himself as a good guy, and at this point, he's already fixed the economy and has done so much to garner trust in everyone, except for, of course, Superman and Batman. But when a meteor threatens to destroy the planet, Luthor goes out of his way to get Superman and Batman out of the picture so he can save the world himself, once again choosing his own selfish desires over the safety of the people of the world. Luthor frames Superman for the murder of Metallo, which leads to a large portion of this movie being Superman and Batman on the run, with so many DC characters going after the bounty. And this is just a ton of fun. The action here is the reason to watch this movie. The powers on display are great and something we can really only see in animation. The Lex appointed group of superheroes were a standout, as we get to see Captain Atom, Katana, Black Lightning, Starfire, Major Force, and Power Girl all in action. But what elevates this film for me, honestly, is the voice cast. We get my favorite Superman, Batman, and Lex Luthor all in one movie with Tim Daly, Kevin Conroy, and Clancy Brown. But there's honestly not much more to talk about when it comes to this movie. Superman stops Lex Luthor, Batman makes his sacrifice play to destroy the meteor in a rocket shaped like the two of them, and the President of the United States faces the consequences of his crimes, which is a totally realistic thing that definitely happens in real life. This will also get a 3.5 out of 5. Superman Batman Public Enemies was at this point one of the most successful films in the DC animated movie universe, so we actually get a rare sequel to one of those animated films. However, this film very much plays as a Superman Supergirl story, as it mainly follows Supergirl's arrival on Earth and her origins. She arrives on Earth in a crashed ship and ends up wreaking havoc on Gotham. Batman and Superman team up to stop her when they realize she's Kara, one of the last living relatives of Superman. They attempt to train her through many methods, which give us some cool cameos from Wonder Woman and other Justice League members until Darkseid joins the picture. He plans on bringing her to his side, as having a Kryptonian as an ally against Superman would give him an advantage, but because I liked the last film quite a bit, I ended up being pretty disappointed in this one. It technically is a sequel to that film, but it really doesn't connect to it besides the mention of Lex being in prison after being impeached. There are plenty of great action sequences here, especially when it comes to these several fights either on Apocalypse or with Darkseid himself. The only real scene where Batman gets to shine though, however, is in Apocalypse when he bargains with Darkseid to release Kara, which is such a Batman move.
Say it. Well played.
He checkmates him so badly here, it was kind of funny, but the final action sequence on the Kent farm with Darkseid is the reason that you watch this film. Superman meets his match against Darkseid, and seeing Kara go from an immature, reckless kid to someone inspired enough by Superman's heroism to stand up against Darkseid was solid. There's also a lot of questionable aspects of Supergirl's interpretation here, which bugged me quite a bit. Her costume is a bit much here, and Superman is overly controlling towards her, which got very frustrating very fast. And worst of all, Superman apparently believes that all human girls are defined by wanting to go shopping, which was his way of showing Kara how to be a normal teenage girl. I thought you were better than this, Clark.
I want to know everything there is to know about being an Earth girl. Where do we start?
I have a pretty good idea.
This was definitely the animated film I was looking forward to the most when I began watching all of these Superman animated films, mainly because the comic of the same name was apparently a large source of inspiration for James Gunn's Superman, and after watching this film I can definitely see why, mainly through the robots, designs, and overall ideologies that Superman has. But let's get through some of the nitpicks first. This movie honestly took me a bit to get into. I think of all the animated films, this felt the most like several issues of comics strung together to create one film. It consists of several seemingly disconnected vignettes, like Superman saving astronauts on a mission near the sun, giving Lois superpowers for 24 hours, a love square between Lois, Superman, and these two random guys, facing off against two Kryptonian refugees who don't have the same moral standards as Clark, and of course facing off against Solaris and Lex Luthor at the very end of the film. All these individual storylines are solid in their own right, besides of course the love square, but the one thing that strings them all together is the story that Clark is dying from an overdose of solar radiation. This plot point creates a great arc for the Lois and Clark dynamic. Because he is dying, he finally lets Lois into his world. He reveals his identity, leading to a fun back and forth of her not believing the clumsy Clark could be the stoic Superman. But it also leads to a weird paranoia subplot of Lois thinking Superman has kidnapped her. I could have done without that, but Superman's gift for her was powers for a day, which was great. But then there's of course the weird love square, which I also could have done without. Honestly, the first act of this film is filled with great ideas, followed by weird choices that I didn't like all that much. But once the film's story gets closer to Superman's death, it became more interesting, which yes, this will be the second time in this video that I'll be talking about a death of Superman type of storyline. Rather than being killed by Doomsday, it was Lex's plan to unleash a clone to attack the astronauts at the beginning of the film, which led to the overdose on radiation that is killing him. Lex starts off so incredibly proud of what he had done to Superman, with him even trying to get Clark to write a story about him dying, but he also has a plan to stop his own execution by using that serum that Superman made for Lois to give him powers for a day, so maybe he can even kill Superman himself. I love the fight that he had with Superman, with him being taken out by the gravity gun, which speeds up his 24-hour timeline. But the other effect that the gravity gun has is it makes Lex see things the way Superman does. He sees how he's been wrong and begins to regret all the time he spent trying to kill Superman rather than saving the world.
If it wasn't for you, I could have saved the world.
If it had mattered to you, Luthor, you could have saved the world years ago.
Superman begins to glow with radiation, and he makes his final goodbyes to Lois before flying into the sun, resolving another subplot with Solaris and the sun dying.
He's not dead. He's up there fixing the sun. And when he's done, he'll be back. and I'll be here waiting for him.
This exact type of storyline is why I love these more standalone animated movies. This movie has no context other than this film itself, and it has no bearing on the future of this character, but the idea of standalone animated films can also be the biggest detractor in this era of animated Superman films. The Superman Batman films are fun and all, but they very much lack any real purpose or message that this film was able to achieve. I like their ability to do whatever they want with these characters, as it won't affect the larger continuity, but it creates a gap in my ability to truly connect with any of these films beyond the hour and 20-minute runtime that they have. All that being said though, this is definitely one of the stronger standalone stories, so I'll give it a 4 out of 5. Superman vs. the Elite was one of the animated films that I had never heard of, but to my surprise, it ended up actually being my favorite of all the animated films. This film follows Superman as he is struggling with his public image. On one hand, he is seen as a hero, but to many, he has the power to bring true peace to all the world with all his power, yet he chooses not to. He could stop all wars, he could take out the criminals who keep on coming back, and he can prevent all death by doing so. During this politically divisive moment in Superman's life, he encounters a new group of heroes dubbed the Elite. The team consists of Coldcast, Manchester Black, Menagerie, and the Hat. Superman works with them for a while as he attempts to figure out if they are friends or foes, but with the world at large turning against Superman and the Elite's willingness to cross a line to kill the bad guys, the film becomes about whether or not Superman's moral code is the right thing to do. And this film truly had everything I love in all the other Superman films I've watched up until this point. It has a playful journalistic rivalry between Clark and Lois. It has a great cast of interesting superpowered characters in the Elite. It highlights Superman's ideology of always doing the right thing when the easier path is violence, and it has starkly relevant political themes that hit a little too close to reality.
Sorry there's no movie.
Don't try to be cute. You're lucky I'm even letting you fly me there. Once we hit the ground, it's every reporter for herself.
Unless I get something really juicy.
Learning.
Unlike a lot of the other animated films so far, this one has a solid focus on a main story that it's trying to tell, with fleshed out themes and character. I absolutely loved the Elite and the kind of moral conflict they brought to the story with their very British punk rock aesthetic. When you have a character like Superman who is so powerful and nearly impossible to beat in a fight, it's hard to establish believable stakes. But when you shift the stakes from whether or not he will die to whether or not the world at large will choose violence over peace, and the only one fighting for peace is our lead character, it feels incredibly tense. Plus, when the members of the Elite are all fighting together, they are powerful enough to believably put Superman's life at risk. You know you have a peak Superman film when there's an epic fight on the moon. Well, maybe not for the quest for peace, but the fight on the moon against the Elite is one of the best scenes in any of these Superman films. They seemingly kill Clark at this point with the world watching, which was really effective, but his quick return with the lack of any moral code afterwards was quite terrifying, and I love that this was Clark's plan the whole time. The Elite, along with the world at large, had to see what an unhinged and morally bankrupt Superman would look like. He is deadly, he is destructive and cruel. He seemingly kills all the members of the Elite leading up to the leader in Coldcast, while civilians are seemingly dying as collateral damage, and his reveal that his robots were helping him protect all the people he quote-unquote kills in this scene to prove a point was so good.
And on my soul, I swear that until my dream of a world where dignity, honor, and justice are the reality we all share, I'll never stop fighting. Ever.
Honestly, I really hope James Gunn's Superman film pulls a lot from this movie. From the trailers, you see Superman interfering in foreign wars and the people questioning his decisions, and you also see Superman standing up to his ideals when pushed by Lois in an interview.
I would question myself in the same situation and consider the consequences.
People were going to die!
You also see a different team of heroes in the Justice Gang who may or may not have different ideologies from Superman of how to be a proper hero. I don't know if his film is going in that direction, but if it does, I'll be so happy because the more I think about this movie, the more I love it, and of all the animated films, I think this one is for sure due for a rewatch already. We do have a lot of Death of Superman adaptations, but we also have a good amount of Brainiac adaptations in the animated era as well. This movie follows Superman and Supergirl facing off against Brainiac, who intends to collect Metropolis as a trophy before destroying Earth and moving on to the next world. And I think the main story and character progression we get here is pretty solid on paper. I like Supergirl a lot in this film. She is still learning to be a hero, but has a really high bar for how she does so set by Superman. But unlike Superman, she didn't live her entire life on Earth. He doesn't remember the hardships of living through the destruction of his own world, and more importantly, she lived through Brainiac terrorizing her own city and seemingly killing her entire family. For her, that was only a few months prior to the events of this film. She was powerless and simply had to watch all the horrors occur right in front of her eyes, and now that she has the powers of Superman, she acts more vengeful. But when faced against the very force that gave her all of this trauma, she recedes back to that hopeless and terrified child that she was when her home was taken from her. When it comes to Brainiac, I still do prefer the character design and the story for him from what I saw, at least in the brief amount of time I watched the animated series, but I did like this take much more than the Superman Brainiac Attacks movie. I like his plans and his MO of destroying worlds while shrinking them down to individual city as a trophy. I also really liked seeing Clark get captured and even shrunk down into Kandor, where he got to meet Kara's parents. He has an opportunity to destroy Brainiac and his ship, but decides not to, as it will destroy the last living survivors of countless planets that Brainiac has taken over the years. So from a plot and villain standpoint, I think this movie is pretty solid on paper, but in execution, I just wasn't all that invested in this story, and I feel bad blaming this movie for my overall underwhelming response to this film. At this point, I had watched so many Superman movies and so many animated films that some of these smaller nitpicks just began to feel a bit more heavy, especially when it comes to how they treat Lois in this story. Lois and Clark are in a relationship in this film, but Superman comes across as extremely controlling in this movie towards both Supergirl and Lois, and I get that Clark feels super protective over Lois as she can die super easily as compared to him or Supergirl, but he doesn't need to step in to save her from some dick at work who's trying to hit on her.
When I'm falling out of a plane, rescue me. Getting ogled by the office pig, I can handle. It's like everything you do is to protect poor Lois.
And what's wrong with that?
I don't need protecting.
Then there's the fact that Clark is too afraid to be publicly in a relationship with Lois, which is also annoying as hell. These plot points do set up a potential arc for Clark in the film, but by the end, Lois is in need of saving once again, and Clark just proposes to her, but rather than it feeling like an earned proposal, it came across as him asking her in order to stop her from complaining about him. And I don't know, maybe I was just tired and annoyed by seeing yet another Superman story, one that I had already seen before in Brainiac Attacks, and seeing yet another Lois and Clark dynamic that felt uneven. Plus, it has become grating for this one to be yet another standalone Superman story that doesn't continue any of these storylines or arcs that I've enjoyed so far, with no proper sequel or continuation to look forward to. 3 out of 5. We have made it to yet another Death of Superman story. Yay! I definitely need to see this story adapted for a third time. But in all honesty, I actually really enjoyed this adaptation for the story. There is still another Death of Superman adaptation that I like more than this one, but I do think that this is my second favorite of the bunch. Unlike Superman Doomsday, this film gives ample time to establish the characters in the world before we get Superman's death. And unlike all the other films so far, this movie is a part of a larger continuity. The proper DC animated movie universe started with Justice League Flashpoint, which I had seen before and is a movie that I really do enjoy, but I never followed up with the rest of the films in that universe besides the Jason O'Mara Batman movies, which I watched when I did a marathon of the Batman movies a couple years ago. Although I guess Batman Hush is technically not a direct sequel to the other Batman movies in this continuity, but is still a part of the same continuity. Honestly, the wiki around this universe is a bit confusing for me, but this continuity does consist of 16 different films leading to Justice League Dark, Apocalypse War as the finale. But the point is that because this movie exists in a larger continuity, the world at large feels more fleshed out, and you get to sit with actual character moments a bit more than the other animated films, which I really appreciated. I really like the Lois and Clark dynamic here. I was on board at first as it was yet another story of Clark being too afraid to let her in on his secret identity, but I think they did it very well. You got some really fun scenes between Lois and his two different personas. You get a scene where Lois meets Clark's parents, which sparks some conflict in Lois as she realizes Clark has been keeping a lot from her, and you even get a really fun scene with the Justice League all showing Clark that he's been quite silly by not letting Lois in on his world. This all leads to the very climactic moment where Clark reveals his identity to her only for her to laugh at Clark's face.
I'm Superman.
Oh, that's good, Clark.
You got me.
But once she is convinced, he leaves a note with one last secret as Doomsday has begun to attack the city, and it is a note saying that he loves her. It's a very sweet moment, immediately followed by tragedy. During all of the Lois and Clark stuff, Doomsday has been fighting the rest of the Justice League. It's always great to see all the members of Justice League in action here. The animation and the power sets were visually striking, but Doomsday was simply too much for all of them to handle, and the fight just goes on in a great way, with the visual storytelling within the fights being always engaging. Wonder Woman passing on the fight to Superman was a very touching moment. The fight then moves on to a bridge, which highlights Superman's willingness to dip out to save a kid and his Game Boy while in the middle of fighting Doomsday. Superman is thrown at Lois's helicopter at one point, which sparks a similar moment to the last Doomsday story, only Superman doesn't throw him into a building, killing a bunch of people this time around, which I did very much appreciate, and even a mechanized Lex Luthor joins the fight, thinking that he can save the day and prove himself as better than Superman. Of course, that very much backfires on Lex. It's an epic fight with incredible animation while always maintaining the heart at the very core of this story.
I've got you.
You've got me. But who's got you?
You need to call in the cavalry.
I am the cavalry.
It all culminates to a point where an incredibly brave Lois walks up to face Doomsday when Superman is seemingly down. It's such a striking visual and a moment that motivates Clark enough for one last push against Doomsday, leading to them killing each other. Clark dies in Lois's arms with the defeated Justice League looking in on them, and they even add a couple more devastating lines of dialogue along with the already iconic quotes from the comic to pour salt in all the wounds.
It's all I ever wanted. Except for you.
It's genuinely devastating. The emotional build to this moment was incredibly effective. The animation for the fight itself and the visual storytelling is unmatched, but in the final moments of the film, after Superman's funeral, his coffin is revealed to be empty, and a mysterious figure that resembles Superman flies off as we cut to credits. This is probably my second favorite animated film at this point, and one that sets perfectly up for a sequel, and luckily we actually get one this time. As for any nitpicks or flaws, I really only have two. Superman's costume in this is probably my least favorite of the bunch. I just don't like the extremely pronounced collar. I don't mind the collar too much in the James Gunn version, but in this one, it just really does not look great, although this is simply a nitpick and doesn't really matter in the large scheme of things. But my main flaw with the film that will come back eventually in the sequel is the fact that there is a team of astronauts that are killed at the very beginning of this film. The leader is optimistic that Superman will swoop in and save them, yet he never shows. One of my favorite aspects of the best Superman movies are the moments where Superman just simply can't save everyone, where he's dealing with one threat, and while that is going on, some other innocent person could be killed. But in here, Superman is just simply training with Wonder Woman, so he definitely could have saved all these people, but he simply chose not to. And what makes it even worse is that this scene is apparently an integral setup for the next film. But overall, this movie is still great. It'll still get a 4 out of 5, but in terms of that one moment, bad Superman. As I mentioned before, I believe that Lois should be the lead character in any arc relating to the death of Superman. In the case of this run of 2 films, they very much do this exact thing. She was definitely prominent enough in the last film to be a proper co-lead, but she's front and center in this film as it follows her investigation into all of the Superman clones or copycats that fill the void left by our fallen hero. We have Superboy, who is a clone of Superman made by Lex Luthor, who once again wants to control the most powerful being in the world. Steel, a mechanized Superman controlled by John Henry Adams, an ally of Superman. The Eradicator, who is a Kryptonian protector of sorts. Honestly, this guy was kind of confusing to me. And of course, Cyborg Superman, who is the antagonist of the story. Lois's investigation leads to many revelations for both this story and the last. Darkseid was apparently the one to send Doomsday to rid the world of Superman, which explains a plot hole of sorts for the last film, which I appreciated. He also created Cyborg Superman from the astronaut whose grudge against Superman is being exploited by Darkseid to take out the rest of the Justice League, along with creating an army of superpowered humans. I really liked all the Darkseid involvement here. It felt like a natural turn for the story, and of course with Darkseid in the picture and Superman out of it, the stakes are inherently set higher, and the way that his plan is foiled is pretty solid as well. Lois and the actual resurrected Superman, who has been healing in the Fortress of Solitude for the entirety of this film, exploit this astronaut's hatred for Superman to go against Darkseid's plan, which I found to be smart. My only real issue with the villain here is that this could have easily been avoided if Clark had just been paying attention when the space shuttle incident happened in the last film, or if the previous film gave any good reason as to why Superman wasn't able to save him, besides him just being somewhere off training with Wonder Woman. I also really enjoyed Lex's involvement here when it comes to Superboy. This poor kid has to deal with someone who sets incredibly high standards for him to be better than Superman despite him just being a kid. I like the push and pull he had towards and against these two fathers of his, both in Lex and Superman. I also like this character's setup, and I'm interested to see what they do with the character in later Justice League films. And Steel was pretty cool too. I liked him in the action sequences, and his look was awesome. But I do think this film was missing the emotional drive that was done so incredibly well in the first part. Lois and Clark's reunion was the closest we got, but the film's plot was a bit too convoluted and overstuffed to have a true moment for the two to be reunited. I did love, however, how Lois saves Superman at the very end of the film. This is easily my favorite Lois and Clark dynamic in any of these animated films, and honestly, one of my favorite dynamics between the two in all of these movies.
Yes. There's still one more thing I need to do.
So overall, this was a very solid continuation of the storyline set in the previous film. The animation was great once again. I really like these characters, and it sets up for an epic finale in the next Justice League film, which I will definitely be watching at some point. But sadly, it's not going to be for the series because, once again, I'm only reviewing movies that have the name Superman in the title. So this one will get a 3.5 out of 5. Alright, we're officially back to the one-off stories. Yay! Superman Red Sun is an Elseworlds tale following Superman, who was raised in Russia, leading to his rise during the Cold War. And similar to the Marvel What If stories, we get to have a ton of fun here following the alternate lives of these characters in unfamiliar settings. Superman is a Russian government asset used by Stalin for propaganda, while Lois Lane is married to Lex Luthor back in the US. And honestly, I really love the idea of Lex Luthor representing American capitalistic ideologies clashing with a Superman who represents a Soviet socialist ideology. You see both the bad in the American side of things and the good in the Soviet side of things, as Lex's schemes and Superman's good nature bleeds through their nurtured upbringings. But that's just one small part of this movie that needed so much more time to be fleshed out. It was very jarring seeing Superman, who was wishing for some things that I agree with, but then goes off to murder millions in an attempt to free other nations from governments that he doesn't like. But on the other hand, it was fascinating watching him hold back from attacking the US as he thinks his ideology will make the US crumble under their own weight. On the flip side of things, it was very jarring seeing a Lois Lane who tolerated Lex Luthor. It makes sense from a certain degree, as Lex wasn't a complete monster for the first half of this story, but once he makes the clone and is cruel in watching it be killed by Soviet Superman, Lois begins to question things but never fully breaks away from him. There is a great moment between Lois and Superman here where she gives him information on Russian people being oppressed and held captive by Stalin, which leads to him questioning his own upbringing, but this connection he makes with Lois only leads to him killing Stalin, which was a crazy scene to see, and save the oppressed, only to become the next Russian leader to oppress his own people. But again, in all this conflicting sequences, you get to see a really lovely scene where Superman confronts this, old friend of his when he was a child, who appreciated him, who championed him to go to the Russian government and to go and be this greater being, this leader for this country, yet this is the woman who is killed by this exact oppression of the government that he is meant to lead. And so he then goes off to kind of do the similar things that Stalin was doing. So again, these themes are a little bit conflicting. All of the arcs here are very close to saying something, but it does come across as a film that throws all of its themes at the wall and waits to see what sticks. I did really like, though, how they sprinkled in so many other DC characters to fill out the ensemble and how they would be used in the Cold War time period. Every hero represents a specific nation, and only further highlights why I think it was important to change Superman's tagline to say a better tomorrow rather than the American way. Any hero with so much power being directly tied to one nation's goals rather than humanity as a whole lead to everyone's downfall, and it was really fun to see certain heroes take sides, like a Russian Batman who is retaliating against Superman's government for being responsible for the death of his family, or the Green Lantern Corps being a US-funded task force being sent over by President Lex Luthor later on in the film, only to be decimated by Superman. But the most interesting use of a DC character here was definitely with Wonder Woman, who was someone who falls in love with the more idealistic front that Soviet Superman presents himself as, but eventually grows to hate him along with all of man because of their true nature to turn to violence to impose their wills over other people. As a purely neutral character who comes close to being manipulated to a side, she was by far the most interesting character. If the film had her as the main protagonist, I think this movie would have fared much better.
What I see is that the man I once admired is long gone. If he was ever there.
Then I am truly sorry.
But as much of its themes were all over the place, this movie had much more to say than any of the other animated films so far. It's definitely a fascinating watch and one that I would recommend. Definitely a 3.5 out of 5 though. After the DC animated movie universe came to an end with Justice League Dark Apocalypse War, a new continuity dubbed the Tomorrowverse was created, starting with the film Superman Man of Tomorrow. This would be a completely new origin for Superman with a new animation style and new DC characters taking the forefront than the past continuity. As I've been focusing solely on Superman films, it honestly felt like a step backwards by once again starting over from the very beginning, but maybe fans of the DC AMU felt differently once this began. And I do know this eventually leads to a 3-part adaptation of the Crisis on Infinite Earth storyline, which I've always heard so much about but never really got into, so I'm not completely against the idea of this new continuity with a new proper endpoint. As for the film itself, it's a decent origin story for Superman. I do think that the last continuity had an advantage by having a universe already thriving with so many heroes being active at this point in time. This one picks up in a world without heroes, besides maybe one newspaper that hinted at an active Batman in Gotham, but besides that, there's really no heroes active in the world. The films in the last universe could honestly have more fun playing around with more characters, where this one is scaled back a bit in scope and was honestly a bit slow for me. But that being said, it has a really fun Lois and Clark dynamic. Lois jumps up very quickly in the ranks at the Daily Planet after exposing Lex at the beginning of the film. Clark is just an intern at this point who aspires to be as good of a journalist as Lois, who is now trying to write an expose on the Flying Man. There's a great bit in this film with Lois trying to pull off a power move or getting the upper hand on Superman through her interviews with him, but because Clark is there to learn her moves first, it makes Superman seem a lot smarter than he would have been otherwise. But the thing I loved most about their dynamic is that Lois goes from trying to find the bad in Superman to realize that he really is trying to do the right thing, and her perspective, along with the world at large, learns to accept him as a hero.
Please don't run your story. I should be the one to tell the world.
First, you have to save it.
The Lex Luthor dynamic was also great here. I absolutely loved how he was constantly scheming in the background of his scenes without the film ever directly letting you in on his plans. At this point, Superman has no real reason to distrust Lex once he is put in jail, and his desperation to fight off against this power-absorbing monster leads him directly into Lex's trap. You see him learn about Superman's weaknesses in a very organic way, and he even gets close to taking out both Superman and the monster at one point. In terms of other DC characters, we also get to see Lobo here, who has made an appearance in the animated series up until this point. It's always fun to see him pop up in stories like this, and it only gets me more excited to see Jason Momoa play this character in Supergirl. Such perfect casting. John Jones, aka the Martian Manhunter, also appears here in a terrifying form. Love the animation style for this character, and I loved how Superman's optimistic view helps John realize that he can also come out of the shadows. The main villain is a janitor at Star Labs who gets taken over by a power-absorbing weapon used by Lobo earlier in the film. There is a bit of a Spider-Man 3 Sandman type of storyline here, but it didn't work quite as well as that did for me, mainly because he wasn't able to speak after a certain point, making his character become less and less human, which became an eventual detractor from the emotion of it all. Plus, Clark could have easily saved him earlier in the film, but he just simply didn't. He even looks over to him and hears a heartbeat down there, but decides not to fly down and save him. So, once again, bad Superman. And I also really dug the new animation style, which I think for me at least, it's the bolder character outlines that I really do like. I believe it's the same animation style used in the Batman Long Halloween movies, which I also really love those as well. So this film was for sure a decent start for the Tomorrowverse, and I'm excited to eventually dive into the rest of the series, mainly because I really want to get into the Crisis on Infinite Earth storyline. So this film, as a start to this new universe, will get a 3.5 out of 5 as well. Honestly, a lot of 3.5s in the animated universe. Alright, we have finally reached the last animated Superman film, and it's quite different from the rest of them, which is honestly quite refreshing. It is another new continuity, which is a little bit annoying at this point, but this time around we do get to focus on Jonathan Kent and my favorite Robin in Damian Wayne. For the first act of this film, I was very worried about this movie being more geared towards children, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, you know, kids need some great movies, but as the film progressed and as we got to get more into the villain of the story, it became much more engaging for me. We start off with a quick montage montage of Superman's upbringing, leading us to see how Lois and Clark are with raising their own family. Jonathan senses that his father is quite distant and missing his baseball games, and in an attempt to run away, he realizes that he has abilities of his own, leading to Clark revealing his identity to his son. They seek out Batman for help with his new powers, which is where we get the budding friendship between Damian and Jonathan, which I absolutely adored. For anyone who questions why Superman and Batman work so well together, despite them being so incredibly different, I think that this is a perfect example of why this dynamic is so special to a lot of people. These two characters represent two completely different upbringings and personality types. Jonathan is much more privileged than Damian, who had a very traumatic and dark upbringing. But it's Damian's upbringing that makes him as smart as he is, and Jonathan's optimism and bravery that balances out his more reckless side. Jonathan is the brute force where Damian is the brains. It's a great dynamic, and it mirrors that of their fathers perfectly. The plot revolves around the world being taken over by the parasite Starro, who also appeared in James Gunn's Suicide Squad, which made me a fan of the character. And I actually think I prefer what they did with this character in this film, as the disturbing nature of the spores taking over Damian and Jonathan's friends and the family was extremely effective. I love the animation of it crawling out of their throats. It was disgusting and quite horrifying for what I thought was a movie geared more towards children. Plus, we had more lines of dialogue and overall intent with the main Starro creature, which wasn't fully explored in the Suicide Squad. There's also a lot of great action with Jonathan and Damian taking on members of the Teen Titans and Justice League, who are all being controlled by Starro, including Batman and Superman themselves, in a very entertaining fight between fathers and sons. And by the end of our story, our two leads are willing to make the ultimate self-sacrifice in order to take out Starro. It's a genuinely great story of friendship, but also a really great father-son story at the very same time. If anything, I would have liked a better balance between seeing Jonathan's family life with seeing more of Damian's family life. It definitely plays much more like a Jonathan Kent movie than a movie about the two of them equally. The animation was also hit or miss for me. It is a mix of 2D and 3D animation, which can be a bit jarring, especially when you can tell that they're using 3D elements as a crutch for some of the lesser shots. But besides that, I found this one to be one of the better standalone animated films that properly took advantage of not being tied down by some greater continuity. And honestly, if this one got a sequel, I would very much be happy to check that one out. This one gets a 4 out of 5.
Well, I do owe you a birthday present.
Oh, well, what is it?
This. Still can't fly.
So there we have it. Those are all the animated films starring Superman in the past 20 plus years. And yes, there are plenty of more films that have Superman featured heavily in it, but if I do all of those, this video would be way too long. So as much as I want to do all of those, this is as much as I can handle for now. Maybe I'll do a deep dive into the Justice League movies at some point in the future. But this animated era has spanned all the years since the classic era to just a few years ago, with the Battle of the Super Sons movie being the last movie to be released in the animated era of Superman. But when it comes to live action, the more modern era of Superman in film started not too long after the animated era began, although it had a much harder time finding success, as the modern era of Superman in film might just be the most divisive yet. But that'll have to wait until part 3 of the Ultimate Superman review series, which will cover Superman Returns all the way up to James Gunn's Superman film, which releases later this week. And by the time this video releases, I think I'll have already had a chance to watch that movie, so definitely subscribe to the channel to see my review on that film as soon as I watch it. And of course, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the animated Superman universe, make sure to leave it a like and comment down below what your favorite film is in this era of Superman. And like I said in the last video, these massive 45 minutes Ultimate reviews are extremely daunting for me, and it took a lot of work. So if you did enjoy this and you want to see more reviews just like this in the future, please let me know. It's honestly really rewarding releasing things like this, and the next time some huge thing comes out, it'd be really fun to do another deep dive on another film series. But that'll be it for me for this video, so thanks everyone for watching, and I hope to see you all in part 3.